Chapter 2. An ethnicist stage in the West. Other than Dubnoff, and just before the advent of professionalization and specialization in the discipline of history, there were two final attempts to produce a total history of the Jews: Zev Yavetz's Book of the History of Israel, which is of relatively minor historiographic value, and the more important book by Salah Whitmire Barron, A Social and Religious History of the Jews. It is not surprising that Yavetz stuck closely to the biblical narrative, as he was one of the new breed of Zionist rabbis who turned the Old Testament from a holy book into a national one while at the same time inveighing against a secular or reformist reading of it. More intriguing is the outlook of the holder of the first chair in Jewish history in the United States, who published the pioneering version of his work in 1937, reworked it and began to republish it in 1952. Although he never completed the project. Like his well-known predecessors Greatz and Dubnoff, Barron was not an avowed Zionist, though he, too, was no stranger to the idea of a modern sovereignty for some of the Jews. And whereas Greatz looked at the history from the vantage point of unifying Germany, and Dubnoff from the crumbling Tsarist Empire, Barron observed the Jews from New York, the greatest refuge of Jews from Eastern Europe, to which he himself had migrated in 1926. This point of view contributed to a freer, less linear discourse than the one being developed at this time in the so-called Jerusalem School and its later successors in the State of Israel. Barron was free from the rejection of the diaspora syndrome that lay at the heart of Zionist historiography, and this accounted for the different compass of his research. Barron's description of the life of Jewish communities in the world is colorful, original, at times unusual. He disliked what he called the whining tone in depictions of the condition of Jews, but in anything connected with the birth of the Jewish people, he could not avoid the prenationalist structures laid down by Greatz and Dubnoff along biblical lines. Thus, in the very opening of his expansive work, he states confidently, "The tendency now prevailing among Old Testament critics is to give ever greater credence to biblical records, including those of the early period. Partly as a result of a general reaction against the extremely radical, almost anti-biblical, higher criticism of a few decades ago, and partly because of our increased knowledge of the ancient Near East, the present generation, on the whole, accepts the historicity of the fundamental facts underlying early biblical narratives. Henceforth, it would therefore be possible to ignore the philological research of Wellhausen and his successors, as Barron claimed American scholars were beginning to do, and instead to rely on the wealth of new archaeological discoveries, because, ever since Dubnoff, the name of the historiographic game was science. Thus, the biblical tradition, though overlaid with legendary motifs, preserved the distinct recollection that Israel's patriarchs had stemmed from Chaldea and more particularly from the cities of Ur and Haran. As we know from British excavations during the last 2 decades, had been an ancient center of Sumero-Akkadian civilization. Whether or not Abraham's father, Terah, and his brother, Nahor, had any connection with like-sounding raiders in Syria and Palestine allegedly mentioned in 2 Ugaritic poems, their names have been plausibly deduced from Mesopotamian localities. Certainly the invention of such coincidental names by a later Palestinian poet or historian, an hypothesis long accepted by biblical critics, would require much more arduous explanations than the now prevalent assumption of a solid kernel of authentic historic tradition in the biblical narratives. From now on, it would be possible to relate the history of the Jews almost exactly as it was told in the Old Testament, minus the wonders and miracles. Supposedly these were volcanic natural phenomena, and the heavy religious sermonizing. History now appeared clothed in a more secular garb, freed from divine metaphysics but wholly subordinate to a specific, well-defined proto-nationalist discourse. Jewish history was the story of a nomadic people born in great antiquity, which had mysteriously and marvelously continued to exist throughout history. Greatz and Dubnoff's great enterprise received, with some adjustments, the honored imprimatur of academe, and biblical truth became an unquestioned discourse, an integral part of 20th century historical research. Barron also resorted to the biblical outlook in dealing with the history of Jews in later periods, not as the story of religious communities existing in symbiosis or conflict amid various religious and popular cultures, but as the narrative of a mobile, exceptional people. The American Jewish scholar was well aware of the epistemological dissonance caused by the depiction of the Jewish past in a nationalistic way, and admitted to insist that peculiar destinies of individuals and nations happen precisely to those individuals and nations with an innate disposition for them may seem to be reaching out too perilously into the realm of metaphysics. Under the same circumstances, however, many other peoples would certainly have perished and disappeared from history. That the Jews survived is largely due to the fact that they were prepared for their subsequent destinies by their early history. To Barron, the Eastern European immigrant in New York, the land was much less significant as the starting point of the unique, dispersed nation, and this ideological aspect is prominent throughout the first volume of his work. As he saw it, Judaism did not spring from nature but in fact represented history's revolt against it. Therefore, the decisive quality of the identity of the eternal people, whose everyday cultural elements varied so much from place to place, was mainly its ethnic origin and its love of the past. The common descent from Abraham, Isaac and Jacob is the main element that secures Israel's exalted position within the family of nations, wherever and under whatever conditions it may happen to live. According to Barron, ethnicity is a kind of nationality, in no way inferior to the sovereign nationality, that lasted only a short time in the history of the Jewish people. Indeed, it is even superior to it in many major qualities, and in those qualities lies the secret of the Jews' persistent strength throughout history. And the birth date of this unique and unifying ethnic nationality, argued Barron, was the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt. Responding to the arguments of Wellhausen and his colleagues, who contended that Jewish monotheism could not have been born in a nomadic society with an undeveloped culture, the New York scholars stated that the ancient Hebrews already had a complex culture while in bondage in Egypt. To imagine the descendants of Abraham as resembling today's Bedouin, he argued, was a romantic mistake. They must have retained a vivid memory of Akhenaten's quasi-monotheistic reform, and Moses must surely have been familiar with the philosophy of the Pharaoh who first proposed the idea of a single deity. Moses' achievement was of course much finer and more original than that of his predecessors. The Ten Commandments was a unique document that enables us to comprehend the situation of the Hebrews of the time. Even more important, the fact that it makes no mention of the temple proves beyond doubt that this codex was composed in the desert and designed to serve a nomadic people. For Barron, the wisdom of Moses lay in his having founded a religion for which neither country nor sovereignty was an essential condition. He therefore devoted relatively little space to the period of the conquest of Canaan, and the rise of the unified kingdom. How could the Hebrews have left Egypt and conquered a country that was under Egyptian power? It must have taken place at a time when Egyptian control had weakened. Why did the mighty kingdom of Saul and David arise and unite the tribes? Because of the pressure of outside enemies. Why did the great kingdom split? Because of divergences and political conflicts, but also Egyptian interference. Concerned with the social and religious history of the Jews, Barron was much less interested in the politics of the kingdom. Instead, the reader is regaled with colorful sociological analyses, which, unfortunately, lacked reliable sources. Barron's rooted anti-political outlook leads him to favor the ancient biblical historians. Despite his reservations concerning Wellhausen's school, he follows Dubnoff in accepting that one ancient biblical historian generally rendered God's name as YHWH while another referred to the deity as Elohim. He opined that the Yahvist came from the tribe of Judah, and the Elohist from Israel. Yet neither of them, Barron stated admiringly, was dismayed by the division of the kingdom, and both saw Israel and Judah as an inseparable unity, a significant fusion that continued throughout the history of the Jews. In their disdain for their respective sovereignties and their preference for the united people, they differed from other kingdoms in antiquity and presaged the future. The respected academic historian evidently did not consider the possibility that later editors might have been responsible for this image of a theological literary unity. Barron describes the fall of the temple and the deportation in a neutral, even a slightly approving, manner. No longer would it be necessary to reside on the soil of Palestine or live under a Jewish government to be considered a Jew. Even in the dispersion, far from their own country and under a foreign king, Jews continued ethnically to be Jews. The percentage of deportees was, he suggested, rather higher than had been assumed by other scholars, and the majority lived well in exile. There were some signs of assimilation, but fortunately the precious ethnicity continued to preserve the people's national identity. The universalism that filtered into Judaism during the Persian period was balanced by extreme isolationism. After the return to Zion, Ezra and Nehemiah did the people a great service, indeed, saved it, by their active ethnic separation, indirectly making an immense contribution to benefit all humanity. Throughout his book, Barron sought to maintain a balance between ethnocentricity, the consciousness of a common origin and unique spirituality that lay at the heart of Judaism, and the humanist universality that he believed the Jewish people carried into exile and made the essence of their being. It must not be forgotten that, to him, ethnicity was not merely a religious culture nor was it a truly secular one. Indeed, he maintained that Jewish ethnicity was some kind of way of life that persisted beyond the set of beliefs and religious doctrines. The meaning he gave to the term remained always ambiguous enough to avoid provoking much criticism from fellow historians and English readers, who did not belong to the Jewish people. In this way, he reinforced the ideological basis for defining the Jews as a generous and valuable ethnos that could exist alongside the other racial groups within the great American nation, without blending too much with them. Like Dubnoff, Barron held that the study of history could become part of the sacred duty of preserving the Jewish identity, and could even replace the religious study that had hitherto fulfilled this vital function. This lack of aspiration in Barron's oeuvre for political sovereignty and for a return to the ancient homeland, that is, the absence of a well-defined nationalist teleology, dismayed another important historian, who responded publicly.